The girl with whom this story will be related once read a novel called At the End of This Love. This best-selling fantasy love novel describes mind-blowing, beautiful, and miserable at the same time love. In this story, a king with a very difficult childhood is rescued by a selfless heroine, and he begins to learn what true love is. And after overcoming many obstacles, these two manage to end up together in the end. However, in the middle of their long-awaited wedding, things did not go as they had imagined. Because of one incident, they both died. One of them was mercilessly murdered on their wedding day, and many readers were brought to tears by the unhappy love of these two, who swore eternal love to each other, and very beautifully left on the same day. And the girl really loved that book too. It was so much so that she reread it many times, and all the time she cried at the moment where those two unfortunate people die. But despite the emotions the story evoked, she never liked the ending. She would have liked to see the characters' efforts pay off in the end, and for everything to end with a happy ending. And each time the girl reread the story, her discontent continued unabated. And then one day, she was the victim of an accident. And when she woke up after all that had happened, she had already noticed that she had been reborn as the heroine of this very story. As soon as the girl opened her eyes, she immediately looked in the mirror and could not believe that this was really happening. The wind in the reflection was not her usual appearance. At that moment, a maid suddenly came in, and when she saw Mrs. Charlotte standing near the mirror and looking anxiously, then yes, she immediately asked if she was all right. The girl, hearing that name, immediately turned to the maid and asked, "Is she really Charlotte now?" The maid replied that that was correct. She was a member of the noble Leicester family, or rather, the daughter of the Duke of Leicester. And when she saw Charlotte's surprised face, she asked if she had already forgotten about it. The girl didn't answer anything to that, but then, smiling, the maid said that there was nothing strange about it, for this was the day she would meet His Majesty the King for the first time as his potential future bride. Listening to this, Charlotte was simply furious. She couldn't believe that this was really happening at all, but she had no choice. So soon she went outside. Since the girl was expected to meet the king that day, she sat in the backyard at a small coffee table and waited for that moment. Charlotte still couldn't believe it was really happening, and that she had been reborn as a heroine right before the main plot began. However, she thought that since people were reborn by getting caught up in some stories, it would be from childhood. It would make a lot more sense that way. For the girl knew perfectly well the ending of this heartbreaking novel, and realized that if she really was reborn as Charlotte, the same thing awaited her. At that moment, a maid suddenly turned to her and said that His Majesty King Lament Dylan Lucas Rostald had arrived. And when Charlotte heard that, she was very surprised. She wasn't even going to look in his direction for a while. But then she realized that it would be very impolite of her. Then the girl turned around and saw right in front of her a gorgeous blonde-haired man who was incredibly beautiful. But she realized that if she married him, they would both die, eventually, at the end. So she certainly didn't want that. Charlotte was just sitting and staring at the king, when suddenly a maid came up to her and whispered, asking her to get up at last because it was impolite. The girl panicked at this moment. She realized that she hadn't stood up when His Majesty came, so she quickly tried to do so. However, because she wasn't used to wide dresses, she accidentally hit the table, and all the tea that was on the table suddenly spilled right over her dress and onto the ground. All the mugs were broken and lying on the floor. The maids immediately panicked when they saw this. They couldn't believe that Madame had actually done it in front of the king. But the man said nothing. He just stood there and watched the girl's actions. Charlotte was panicking incredibly badly at this point. She recognized that she hadn't done it on purpose, because she just stared at his beautiful face, and her dress had caught on the table. But then she decided that since things had already gone this way, the girl should apologize, and she bowed to the king and apologized for her actions. Then the girl laughed, and said that she believed that they would not be able to have a tea party any longer. So this was her farewell to him. And when Charlotte's maid heard this, she was just beyond furious, not understanding what mistress was even doing. But at that moment, the man who had been standing silent all this time suddenly became angry and asked, "Is she really leaving now? Or did she make all this commotion on purpose so that she would have an excuse not to go out with him? But Charlotte kept perfectly calm and said that not at all, for she really hadn't done it all on purpose. In fact, it was very hard for the girl to stay stone-faced, because the psychological pressure from his side was unbelievable. However, she had to bear it. Charlotte realized that if he hated her as a girl with bad manners, it would be out of the question, and the worst end of the story could be avoided. The king suddenly frowned and asked, "Is she really not even trying to make an effort to please him?" From his intonation, the girl realized that this surprised him very much. But she needed to keep playing her part, so fixing her hair, she sighed heavily and said that to be honest, she wasn't interested in him at all. Of course, it was all a lie, for Charlotte was downright fond of him, and even when the girl in her world was reading a story, he was always her favorite main character. And that's exactly why she's doing this, because she doesn't want him to just die. At this point, the king said that this was very interesting, and he began to reach out his hand to the girl. He took her close and pulled her to him and kissed her wrist and said that it was very interesting, and it turns out that women like that also existed. He held her hand very tightly and added that he actually thought that absolutely everyone would flatter him and flirt just to please him. Charlotte was incredibly surprised when she heard this, but then he suddenly asked her what her name was. The girl blushed. She had not expected it to go this way. She skillfully hoped that he would hate her. But the opposite happened, and he was only more interested in her. Then, at the king's command, the maids quickly cleared everything away and set new dishes on the table and made new tea. The king sat down with Charlotte to talk so that their tea party could take place. In fact, according to Charlotte's plan, by now she should have returned home loathed by Mr. Dillon, and the girl still doesn't understand how it happened that the tea party took place. She didn't expect that the king's influence could have such an effect even on her servants. Then suddenly an aide to the king named Leonardo Blower spoke up and said that His Majesty had already met with many potential brides. However, he turned to Charlotte and said that she was the first person with whom he had a real dialogue. The girl, hearing this, showed no interest and just continued to drink her tea. In fact, her mind was a mess. She didn't understand why this was happening to her, and she assumed that maybe the story was giving her a head start. Delane spoke then and asked Charlotte if she happened to have a fiancé. The girl, wiping her mouth with a napkin, said that she thought he already knew the answer to that question, given that she was in this place right now. But he only said that he understood. And then they continued to drink tea in absolute awkward silence. The servants and even the king's aide could sense this strained atmosphere, making them feel uncomfortable. But that didn't scare Charlotte because she knew she wasn't even interesting enough to talk to. She also thought that if things weren't working out between them, he might as well just leave her alone. For some time there was absolute silence between the king and the girl. But then Leonard, who certainly did not like this atmosphere, suddenly spoke. He turned to the king, asking if he would like to show Miss Charlotte this beautiful garden. He also said that he thought that while they were looking at the beautiful flowers, they might even have some interesting topics of conversation, and then they could learn a little more about each other. Dylan suddenly thought for a moment, and afterward he got up from the table and said, "Okay, that's a pretty good idea." Charlotte, of course, did not like all this. Then she decided to act at once, and said that she did not really want to trouble His Majesty, for he was probably tired enough as it was. The girl really wanted to be allowed to leave at last, so that she could figure out what to do next. But then suddenly the king held out his hand and said that he didn't mind, because he told her hers was good. Then he suddenly inquired, or whether she thought the noble house of Leicester disobeyed the king's orders. Charlotte thought it very unfair that he was referring to the whole house of Leicester. She had no choice but to attack, so she held out her hand and said that of course they would comply. The girl knew she had to do everything during this walk to make the king hate her. However, she also realized that it would be very bad if she refused, and he thought the Leicester house was being insubordinate. Then all the other innocent people would suffer. The girl urgently needed to come up with a plan to make him hate her, even just so he wouldn't end up getting killed. They soon passed into the king's garden, and Charlotte, looking around, remarked that it was very beautiful, and it was not for nothing that everyone praised the garden of the royal palace so much. They approached one of the plants, and the girl, gazing mesmerized at the flowers, said that these roses were of incredible beauty. The king replied that they were at the peak of blooming at the moment. So she's very lucky because not everyone gets to see it. Charlotte was embarrassed to hear that. She actually got a strange feeling because that phrase made her feel as if she had heard it once before. This caused the girl to stop for a while. The king looked at her and saw Charlotte's worried face. Then he asked, "What's wrong?" The girl immediately realized that she was not allowed to show her weaknesses and quickly smiled, saying that nothing of the sort had happened and everything was fine. They walked on and on, looking at different kinds of plants. Then Dylan asked her if she liked flowers at all. She answered that she liked them, but not enough to be a fanatic about them. In fact, in the book, when the heroine and the king were together in his garden, a very strange thing happened. Charlotte felt some unusual feeling inside her for a while, and then suddenly realized, remembering the plot of the novel, that someone had tried to kill Mr. Dillon that day. The girl was horrified. She didn't understand how she could have forgotten about such an important plot twist. She tried to recall the details and realized that immediately on his way out of the rose archway, he had been attacked by assassins. And just at that moment, Dylan took her hand and told her that if you went through that archway, there would be roses with bigger petals next that might impress her. Charlotte realized that they were already near her, and she had to figure out what to do in a situation like this right away. In fact, in the book, the king was shot in the arm when he covered the heroine with himself. The assassination attempt was very unsuccessful at the time, and of course nothing serious happened. Then Charlotte suddenly came up with one very brilliant idea of what she could do. The girl decided that if she ran away from the king after he protected her, the man would think that she was just a horrible person who didn't have an ounce of empathy. She decided that this was the moment he was going to hate her for sure. And besides, Leonardo and the others would quickly come to his aid, so it wouldn't be a big deal. But at that moment Dylan suddenly looked at her in surprise, for he saw her looking anxiously away. In fact, at that moment Charlotte saw the assassin standing behind him in the bushes, holding his sword. The girl was very frightened at the sight of him, but tried to calm down, telling herself that everything would be all right. In fact, in the story, Mr. Dillon is only done with a small injury in his arm. But she realized that because of this incident they would never get married, and therefore not be killed. At that moment, the assassin had already started to run up, holding a sword and aiming it at the king. The girl thought to herself that this was why she wouldn't do anything. For a while Charlotte just stood there with her eyes closed. But when she heard the assassin approaching, she realized she couldn't just stand there. So she took matters into her own hands and pushed him aside. The man looked at her in surprise, not sure what she was doing, but then he heard a loud clang. It was a sword that had missed and hit the ground. Dylan, hearing this and seeing the stranger in front of him, immediately started screaming, saying that there were murderers in the place and calling for Leonardo's help. Then Charlotte also cried out, saying that His Majesty was in the garden and asking for Leonard's help, who was standing outside, heard it all at once. The assassins, who were only 2, realized that their mission had failed and they were going to get caught right away, so they started telling each other to leave and ran away. Charlotte was still in the king's arms and breathing heavily. Tears appeared in her eyes because the girl was very frightened. She took a while to get her breathing back to normal, but then suddenly she heard Leonard running behind her, asking His Majesty if he was all right. The man had already called the guards, and they were all armed. Charlotte was still lying on the king's chest, shaking with fear and worrying that something bad was going to happen. All the while she exhaled in relief at the thought of it finally being over. Then Dylan suddenly moved closer to her and called her name in her ear. The girl immediately woke up from her shock and realized that she was still in the king's arms. So Charlotte quickly moved away from him and grimly began to apologize for what had happened. However, the man paid no attention to this. He only thanked her for what she had done, saying that thanks to her sagacity, he was all right. Charlotte wouldn't look him in the eye and told him she wasn't worth thanking and also apologized for touching him without permission. The girl also said that she would understand perfectly if he ordered her to leave his palace now. But at that moment, Dylan suddenly pulled his hand to her hair. He corrected them and said that was certainly not required. For a while the man just stared at her beautiful and flushed face with fear and embarrassment, But afterward, he pulled the girl closer, saying that he was ordering her to stay in this palace as his potential bride. When Charlotte heard this, she was incredibly shocked. She didn't understand how this could have happened, because her plan was something else entirely. According to the girl's idea, His Majesty Dylan should have simply hated her and chased her out of the house. However, by a strange coincidence, Charlotte will now remain in this place in the women's section of the palace as his potential bride. The next day, her personal maid came by and said with a smile on her face that this was to be expected from Mistress. She also said that His Majesty had personally recognized her as worthy to be his bride candidate. She also heard that her parents were overjoyed at the news. Charlotte laughed nervously, and afterward she said that her going home hadn't even been considered, so they'd made her a whole collection of dresses for living in this place. The female part of the palace in this country is not particularly large. This is because the previous king was a ladies' man and had a lot of mistresses who had to be accommodated somewhere. After the death of the previous king, this part of the palace began to be used by the current king as a place of residence for his bride candidates. And to enter this palace is considered the highest honor. The flow of aristocrats who want to send their daughter to this place to make a queen out of her never runs out. In fact, Mr. Dylan disliked the previous king, and was himself particularly slow to start any relationships with women. But to put it more accurately, it was meant to be. And Charlotte has absolutely no idea why things happened the way they did. The girl suggested that it was probably because she is the heroine of the book. However, she found it hard to believe that there was some invisible force at work that prevented her from trying to change fate and move the plot in the right direction. Charlotte really hoped there was no such thing. If it went on like this, there was no way she could avoid a bad end. So the girl must urgently think of something to make Mr. Dylan hate her, and they will never meet again. As the maid was about to leave, Charlotte turned to Layla and asked which girls His Majesty liked in her own opinion and observation. The maid suddenly stopped and wondered why she was asking so suddenly, for she was already quite attractive, and perhaps even to the king's taste. To this, Charlotte replied that she was talking about something completely different, and simply asked that she answer her question honestly. The girl thought that in this way perhaps she might be able to find some clue, and if she knew how Mr. Dylan was seen by the inhabitants of this world. Then Layla reflected and said that His Majesty actually liked to keep even a rumor of himself at a certain distance, and many aspects of his life remained a mystery. However, there are many rumors about the bride candidate who was in this palace before Charlotte. When the girl heard this, she wondered if there was really someone with whom he had a very good relationship. However, Layla replied that it was not at all, and that it was the other way around. She did not know how to find the right words to explain this story, and after a while said she used her feminine charm and boldly tried to get close to the king as soon as possible. Charlotte didn't understand at first what she was talking about, or why boldly, but then the meaning of the word came to her. The girl couldn't believe that his previous candidate had directly tried to seduce him. But Layla went on and said that this was exactly what was happening. However, the king didn't fall for her charm and simply rejected her brutally. He chased the poor girl out of his palace. Naturally, she too ceased to be a candidate for his bride. Some also say that since this happened, other candidates have specifically started behaving like proper noble ladies. When Charlotte heard this, she immediately liked that she was able to recognize this video. It is very useful information. She also thought about the fact that this world was incredibly similar to medieval Europe, so everyone expected women to be modest and pure. And it turns out that if the girl starts acting the other way, maybe her plan will work. So the girl immediately turned to Layla and asked if she could get everything ready for the bath right away. When the maid heard this, she was very surprised, but of course she obeyed the mistress and prepared everything. At this very time, Dylan was sitting in his incredibly large bathroom, sipping wine and relaxing after a hard and long day. Then Charlotte opened the door and wanted to go in. In fact, she wrapped herself in a towel, for she was about to put her plan into action. In fact, Charlotte in the book was also quite a modest and pure girl, and even touching a man's hands was enough to make her blush. She was the whole standard of innocence. So Charlotte decided that if she behaved in the opposite way, perhaps she could overcome this invisible force that constantly prevents her from making her plan a reality. With seduction, The girl had definitely decided this time that she was going to make him hate himself, so that's what she was going to do. But at that moment, she made a loud noise, and the man immediately caught up and started to stand up, looking towards the exit. He picked up his sword as well, wondering who it was. The girl immediately realized that she had no way out and had to go, but of course emotionally, she wasn't ready yet. However, Charlotte soon entered the room in a very charming way. When he saw her, he was very surprised and stammered and asked what she was even doing in this place. Charlotte immediately tried to make her voice not shake and smiling asked His Majesty if it wasn't obvious. Then she winked at him and said that he understood everything very well, and at that moment, she thought that she was very good at it. Charlotte also decided that the gentleman of the affair, but exactly the kind of lecherous girls didn't like, so it must work out. The man at this point tried not to look at her and averted his gaze as much as possible. There was a very awkward and rather long silence between them. Then the girl thought that he should say something, because she was standing almost naked in the middle of the bathtub. The girl also thought about doing something now that she wouldn't even be able to get married later. But then she realized that she just didn't want to get married, so that didn't stop her. So Charlotte got brave and started climbing into his huge bathroom, and herself at this moment in her head, praying that they would send her away soon so she could finally not have to go through all this shame anymore. Then Charlotte turned to His Majesty and asked him to accept all her feelings. The girl looked very attractive, even though she was trembling, for she was very uncomfortable. She really wanted it to be over soon. But at that moment things frowned, and he said that she didn't seem to want to even try to please him, and why her behavior had suddenly changed so immediately, he didn't understand. Then the girl remembered her words, which she had completely forgotten about saying that she wasn't interested in him at all, and laughed nervously and asked, "Was it really like that?" Then she pulled the towel down even lower so that all her assets were clearly visible, and holding out her hand to him, told him that he could do whatever he wanted anyway. In fact, that was her crowning move. Dylan stood and just stared for a while, then grabbed her hand and started pulling her closer to him. The girl at this point got very excited. She actually thought about the fact that he was finally disappointed in her and would kick her out right now. But to her great surprise, it was nothing like she had imagined, and Dylan was only getting closer and closer to her with each passing second. Then he whispered in her ear that he wouldn't even mind if the girl took the initiative. When Charlotte heard this, she was shocked. She hadn't expected to hear that from Dylan, and the man wanted to move on. The girl didn't understand how this had even happened, and began to cover her body with the towel. The towel was so small, however, that it covered almost nothing. Charlotte didn't understand how this could have happened at all, and the man came closer and closer to her. But suddenly seeing her frightened face, the man asked, "What happened?" She wanted it so much. The girl did not understand what was happening, for His Majesty hated impudent and lecherous girls. He moved closer and closer to her, and when their lips were about to kiss, the girl felt nothing. She closed her eyes and trembled violently, and after a while, when Charlotte realized that nothing was happening, she opened her eyes. She saw the man turn away and start laughing loudly. Dylan looked at her then, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and replied that he thought so. Of course she didn't mean anything by it. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he meant. However, the man didn't point her in the other direction and asked, "Is she trying to make him hate her on purpose?" She blushed as she heard this, because she knew it was true. But she couldn't guess how he could have known about it at all. Dylan moved farther away from the girl so she wouldn't be so uncomfortable, and she said, embarrassed, that she hadn't really thought of anything like that. However, then he looked at her and said that she had said she wasn't going to try to get him to like her, hadn't she? Charlotte was purposely averting her gaze, for she was too embarrassed, and she said she had said such words. But that didn't mean she was trying to make him outright hate her, and she thought to herself at that moment that, of course, that was what she had been trying to do all along. But it's not because she's trying to go against his will to assert any of her rights. No, she just doesn't want a bad ending. Then Dylan suddenly smiled and said he didn't know why she was doing all this. But he thought that Charlotte would turn out to be a very interesting girl, At this point, he began to fix his hair very nicely and winked at her and asked what she was going to do next. Charlotte couldn't get her thoughts together. When she saw his incredible beauty, she was confused. But then she realized she had nothing else to do, so she decided to play dumb and said she didn't know what he was talking about, and she'd been completely serious the whole time. But suddenly Dylan interrupted her and came closer to her, asking if she was going to go on like this. But if she did, he wouldn't hold back any longer. Charlotte immediately slipped out from under him, realizing that she couldn't go on like this. Then she nervously said that he should stop there and said goodbye to the man. When the girl immediately ran out the door and slammed it behind her, Dylan, left alone, had no way of knowing that this had even happened. He sighed heavily then, thinking that this girl was a very interesting person indeed, and he would never be bored with her. The next morning when Charlotte woke up, she was still embarrassed about the situation, and she was disappointed that all that she had done had been in vain and had ended in disgrace. And besides, Mr. Dillon now knew that the girl was trying to make him hate her. She thought about what she knew about the man, not realizing if he was like that in the book too. After all, the girl, when she read the novel, remembered him more calm and restrained. And when she lived the reality, he turned out to be completely different. At that moment, Layla suddenly came in, said hello, and wished "Oh, mistress, good morning," but seeing her surprised look, asked if something was wrong. Charlotte, seeing the tea tray, said that nothing was going on at all and she was fine, and thanked the girl for her work. As the girl started to drink tea, she thought about the fact that she needed to work out a plan of action anyway, and how to make the man hate her after all, and finally kick her out of this house, so that the ending would not be as sad as in the original story. She realized that such direct attempts were probably not appropriate for this situation, so she had to find a way around it. But suddenly the lady came to her, holding a blue and very pretty dress. Layla asked if she would be wearing this dress all day. She said it was very simple and modest, so His Majesty would certainly like it. When Charlotte heard this, she immediately came up with an idea. So after a few days, the girl found for herself the most lewd outfit she could think of. And after that, the girl went straight to the master's house. Layla followed her anxiously and wondered if they should go back and change the outfit after all. But the girl protested and said that she would not go back, let alone change clothes, because she wanted to go for a walk. The girl was dressed very nicely, but at the same time, she was very fancy. In fact, she had found such a dress especially for this purpose, so that she could walk all over the estate in it, hoping that the Duke would see it and get very angry. Since her plan to invade the bathroom had failed, now she had to come up with something new, and she was really hoping to make everyone around her outright disappointed in her with a revealing outfit. In the place where she is going now, she will be seen by a lot of people, and this will play to her advantage, for there are many maids passing by that corridor, as well as standing knights who guard the whole castle. Charlotte walked on with her head held high, though she was embarrassed. Charlotte liked the attention and stares, which was exactly what she needed. In fact, a girl in such lewd attire was definitely not worthy of being a queen. However, in her previous life, such outfits were quite common. Therefore, she was not ashamed at all, because she was used to walking like this. As Charlotte walked further and further away, she suddenly saw the king and his assistant ahead of her. They stopped and looked at her in surprise. Then Layla immediately came over to the girl and told Mistress that this was all going to end very badly. So she suggested that before it was too late she should quickly go back and change her clothes. Charlotte had no desire to listen to her at this point. Dylan continued to stare at her without taking his eyes off her. Then he turned away from the girl and with a heavy sigh replied that he was just thinking about what she would think of doing next time. Charlotte, watching him, was immediately pleased, for she saw the disgust on his face. So he was definitely disappointed in her. The girl became in a very strange pose, where she showed all her virtues and asked, "And what is wrong? After all, she looks as usual." Well, the man replied that there was nothing wrong with that. And after that, coming closer, he asked, "Did she herself come up with such a design for the dress?" Charlotte was a little surprised at his reaction at first, but then she pulled herself together and said, smiling, "Of course." The girl ran her hand over her outfit and added that it was all entirely her idea. And at that moment, she thought to herself that it was certainly not the tailor's fault. She didn't want him to get hurt because of her prank. Dylan, hearing this, turned away from her and thought to himself. Charlotte at that moment was very pleased. In fact, she thought so. The outfit even made him feel disgusted. But at that moment, Leonardo smiled and said that apparently the rumors that had already spread throughout the palace were very true. When Charlotte heard this, she was downright delighted. She liked the fact that rumors were already spreading throughout the palace. So now she could safely say that her plan was even more successful. But at that moment, Dylan suddenly spoke. He sounded very serious, and his face was menacing. The girl herself at this point was really looking forward to this second, when he could already scold and chase her out of this place. However, at this point, the man said that she really does do very unexpected things time after time, and the girl reduced the amount of luxurious silk used to the minimum that all aristocrats chase after. And her outfit doesn't even need any jewelry, which also makes the job easier for jewelers and low-income people. Dylan said admiringly that her approach is to emphasize natural human beauty, and that he is downright delighted by it. Charlotte, hearing this, was very surprised, and the man, extending his hand to her, said that these were really revolutionary ideas on her part, and he was very proud of the girl. Charlotte herself stood there with an innocent face, not understanding what had happened at all, and how he could say such words, for she wanted him to just kick her out and scold her, and nothing else. Dylan kept talking and said that the design of her dress was very original, and everyone in the palace couldn't stop admiring it. And it was indeed so. The guests who came to the palace saw her outfit and directly envied, because it was very original and innovative. Even many men liked her approach to the design of this dress, because it felt like a new era, something new in their lives. When Charlotte heard this, she couldn't contain her anger. She did not understand how they could consider it revolutionary and original. The girl thought that they, when they saw this dress, would feel it to be nothing but lewdness and vulgarity, and would judge her for it. In that case, she had to come up with something new, and the girl waved her hand and said that meant he preferred such revealing garments as well. When she saw Dylan's face, she felt incredibly ashamed of her words. But she had no other choice. She had to resort even to extreme measures. But at that moment, the man smiled and said that there was nothing more to be done with her. After that, he took his jacket off his shoulders and threw it over the girl's shoulders. When Charlotte felt the heaviness of his jacket, she was very surprised, and the maids who stood on all sides of her directly began to smarten up, saying that they were incredibly well suited to each other. But the girl's own mind was in complete chaos. She didn't understand what was going on and why he was doing this. After all, she wanted all the people to think that she was unworthy of the Lord. But when she heard the conversation and the maids, she realized that they understood everything completely wrong. Then Dylan spoke suddenly, turning to Leonardo and asking that he walk the girl to her room so she wouldn't catch a cold in the meantime. Then the maids began to address the mistress. One of them said that her dress was beautiful, and she would like to wear it too. The other maid was only going on and on about how she was incredibly well suited for His Majesty, and they were rooting for her candidacy. Charlotte was a little embarrassed by all these compliments, but she thanked them and went with Leonardo toward her room. When the man escorted her out, Charlotte immediately closed the door and stood there for a while, not understanding why things had turned out the way they had, and why whatever plan she'd thought of had failed. At that moment, Layla, who was just cleaning her room, came up to her. The girl said that everyone was talking about how good her relationship with His Majesty was, and added that she was very proud of her. The girl laughed nervously when she heard that, and thought about the fact that they were heading straight for a bad end. And if things continued like this, she wouldn't be able to do anything else. And since she had one plan in mind but didn't want to put it into action, but apparently fate leaves her no choice, so she's gonna have to go with it. Charlotte realized that this plan would lead to the downfall of her reputation both in the palace and in her family, and it is a stick straight in two ends. But at that moment, Layla suddenly saw her worried face and asked if something was wrong or if she had another unusual idea. The girl walked over to her and took the maid by the shoulders, then told her that if everything worked out, she promised to grant her any wish. The maid was a little surprised, but remained calm and said that it was really enough for her to be near her mistress. She didn't need more than that. This made Charlotte feel uncomfortable. She had a strong sense of guilt over what she had to do, but she couldn't give up her plan. The girl mentally apologized to her, thinking that when this was over she would be sure to explain everything to her. But she had to do it now. After this conversation, Charlotte changed her clothes, and they came to a rather crowded place. And Charlotte immediately started screaming, asking how it was so, and asking Layla to answer why she had done that. The maid knelt with her head down and replied to the mistress that they were now in a crowded place, and she was very uncomfortable talking about it. The other maids, who were just cleaning the room, didn't understand what was going on, or why Mistress Charlotte was so angry. At this point, however, the girl began to scream, turning to Layla and asking how one dress could take so long to sew. The maid said in a trembling voice that the tailors were now hard at work sewing her design. But Charlotte did not want to hear all that and said that she spoke as if she were their boss, but the girl wanted to know the real reason. She didn't want all these silly excuses. The maid was about to say something, but the girl interrupted her and said that if she said it had to be done in one evening, then it had to be done that way. As harsh as Charlotte's voice seemed, deep down she was actually very ashamed of her behavior, and she didn't want to scold Layla, because there was nothing to scold her for. However, in order for her plan to work, she has to do it. So Charlotte kept asking how many years she had been serving in this palace. And in that time, she could have already served in the royal palace if she tried a little harder. Of course, Charlotte didn't really think so, and it was all just for the sake of her plan. The girl was incredibly ashamed of her behavior, but she couldn't stop, because then everything would be useless. The maids, who were standing nearby, immediately began to whisper. One of them said she hadn't expected Charlotte to be so selfish, and they felt sorry for Layla. Hearing those words, the girl got excited, because she's just trying to make everyone think how selfish she is, since she was bullying her maid. So she concluded that her plan was starting to work. Charlotte's reputation will fall like a stone off a bridge, quickly and painfully. And for this plan, no matter what the girl does, there will be at least one victim. However, this effect speaks for itself. It was actually getting harder and harder for Charlotte to scold the maid, because she didn't think so, and she felt very ashamed of herself for saying such horrible things. What she wanted to do now was to fall on her knees and apologize to the innocent girl. Charlotte thought about the fact that, if her plan succeeded, she could apologize honestly and repay Layla in full. Then the girl continued screaming and was about to say what she would do to her if the girl didn't understand. But then she was suddenly interrupted by Dylan's voice, who came up and asked Charlotte to stop. She immediately turned in his direction and was surprised to see his stern, angry face. In fact, she was glad because he was just in time. He said in a stern voice that he never even thought she would berate her maid in such a crowded place where everyone would be watching and listening. Then suddenly his face grew even angrier, and in a quiet voice stretching each word he asked her not to disappoint him. Charlotte was very surprised to hear that. In fact, she was over the moon. She had finally succeeded in putting her plan into action, even though she had to resort to such terrible methods. However, the girl was now very satisfied. You see, he had finally hated her, so now all she had to do was the final finishing touch. Charlotte has gone to His Majesty and begged his pardon, but she wishes him not to interfere, for it is an internal affair of the House of Leicester. Dylan, hearing this, was outright confused. He didn't expect that the girl could reach the courage to say such words to the king's face. Charlotte curtsied, however, and asked that he let her apologize for making such a fuss in a public place. She might have gone a little overboard with that. So the girl also said that she was leaving right now. After that, she turned to Layla in a rough voice. The maid jumped on the spot out of surprise and fear and went straight to her. But Charlotte said that Layla might not come back until she had finished the work she had to do. Then the girl turned around and began to walk away quickly. When she got back to her room, she immediately collapsed on the couch and buried her head in the pillow. She was incredibly ashamed of her behavior, and guilt was eating her up inside. And the girl even got the feeling that she'd gone a little overboard and didn't know if Layla would even forgive her, even when she explained the whole situation. Still, She was comforted by this thought that the plans had succeeded, and now the king would definitely be angry with her and kick her out. So there would be no bad ending. At that moment, however, her grieving was suddenly interrupted by a heavy knock on the door. Layla ran into the room and turned to her mistress. She jumped up on the bed and asked what was wrong and why she was screaming. However, the maid said with joy on her face that His Majesty was very eager to see her as soon as possible. Layla helped her out of bed and started shoving her in the back, pointing to the exit, telling her that they absolutely had to hurry. At that moment, Charlotte thought that this was the moment he would finally inform her that he wanted to take her off his list of bride candidates right now and just kick her out of his house. The thought alone, however, made her happy. But she realized that she couldn't get her hopes up before she knew the final result. So soon afterward, as the king had requested, she came to his office and, bowing, said that she had come by His Majesty's orders. Dylan looked very serious and stern. He suddenly wondered if she even realized why he'd called her in so urgently. The girl lowered her head and said in a sad voice that yes, it was all about the recent incident for sure. Even though Charlotte set the whole thing up on her own, she's sad that her favorite character is starting to hate her. However, they still have a chance to avoid a bad ending. His Majesty can survive. The girl really wants him to someday find that person with whom he will be truly happy, because of whom he will not have to die. Dylan got up from his seat at that moment and moved closer to the girl. Charlotte said that he had decided that she was not worthy to be his bride candidate. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and then she turned around, starting to run away, apologizing to the king, saying she deserved it. However, Dylan immediately ran after her and grabbed her shoulder and asked her to wait and calm down, and wondered what she was even talking about. Charlotte immediately stopped and began to wipe away her tears. She didn't understand why he was reacting the way he was, because she'd expected him to react differently. However, the man moved closer to her, and running his finger over her face, asked how he could kick her out of the palace. He also said that it was quite the opposite, and that she was a very good girl. When Charlotte heard this, she stood in a stupor and did not understand why he thought she had done the right thing. She also didn't understand how he could not hate her after that. But at that moment Dylan smiled and said that he hadn't thought her extraordinary plan would succeed. But the girl herself thought to herself that it didn't quite look like her plan had succeeded after all. Then she started to turn away from the man and said that she didn't quite understand what he was trying to tell her. Charlotte tried to leave again, but he wouldn't let her. The king smiled with a glimpse of Layla, who was standing behind, and told the girl not to be modest, for her maid was very grateful even. When Charlotte heard this, she was very surprised. She did not understand how the maid could be grateful, for she had told her nothing about her secret plan. Layla turned to her mistress at this point and smiled and thanked her. And then she wondered if she really knew all this. The girl, hearing this, became even more confused, not realizing what she was supposed to know. Layla, seeing her puzzled face, said that she must have already guessed that of all the candidate brides, only her king had honored her with so much more attention. That is why her position as the girl's personal servant was the reason for her unusual treatment. When Charlotte heard that, she was very surprised. She didn't even know that Layla was having a hard time because she had been promoted. In fact, many of the maids even refused to tell her anything or help her in any way. Layla said that the maids in the women's section of the palace and the others in other parts began to just avoid her, and she could not get into this group because no one wanted to accept her. Everyone thought that she had some special status and was not worthy to be among them. Leonardo suddenly entered the conversation and said that they were just jealous, probably thinking that in this place Layla was taking advantage of her position, and so she was getting more than them. The maid agreed with him and said that they probably thought she was even better than everyone else. When Charlotte heard this, it now made sense to her why it was that Layla spent most of her time by her side and kept coming back so sad, for example, after the laundry, where she came into contact with the other maids. The maid said it was only because of this Charlotte concert that things changed dramatically and people didn't suddenly think she was being treated horribly there. That's why they began to try to even support Layla in some way. And as the girls soon found out, they're not having an easy time either. And seeing her in that state, They felt that there was no difference between them and they were very much alike. Then Layla proudly lifted her head up and said that naturally, she immediately replied to them that they had jumped to conclusions. So the mistress could have no fear about the opinions of others. Charlotte was still surprised, not understanding what was even going on or why all of this was being kept from her. When Dylan called the maid over to him, she immediately began to talk him down, saying that the girl was just sticking up for her, and Layla was sure she had nothing wrong in mind. So the man said he stepped in at that point and settled all the issues. So now Charlotte's reputation is unlikely to decline much after this incident. The girl, hearing this, was even more upset. After all, she was just getting them all to think badly of her and just kick her out. But actually at that moment she learned something new for herself, that Layla was very hard because of her. Charlotte had no idea that the others would somehow squint at her and discuss her behind her back, or because of her being her personal maid. So the girl went up to Loli and took her hands in her own and apologized to her. She also said that she could not do anything to help her, and blamed herself for that. The maid was surprised at her mistress's behavior. She said at once that there was nothing to thank her for it should be the other way around. It was Charlotte who had pretended to be a villain in order to help her. It was only because of this pretense that Layla was finally able to talk to the other maids, and she really didn't even think she would ever be able to. Dylan, upon hearing this, smiled and told her to take advantage of it, and further develop a good relationship with them. Leonardo also smiled at them, and said that it was a very good idea. But at that moment, he suddenly sighed heavily and said that there were other ways to help Layla after all. It wasn't necessary to resort to such cruel methods. At this point, Delon came closer to her and, stroking her head, told her that she should think of herself sometimes too. Charlotte, hearing all this, blushed with shame. She was ready to cry out in anger, unable to understand how this could have happened. Since that day, some more time had passed, and now Charlotte began to work out a new plan, for the previous one, in which she had invested all her strength, had failed miserably. But the girl had no time to get discouraged, for she had a little time left. From the moment the maids saw the mistress, they admired her, and said that pretending to be a villain for the sake of her maid was very noble. Many even wanted to step into Layla's shoes and serve Charlotte. In fact, the girl was very glad that since that day, the maids had managed to build a good relationship with the others after all. But still on this day she's going to act dramatically and decisively to make Mr. Dylan hate her. And since her plans are failing one by one, then she needs to think less and just act straight. So it wasn't long before Charlotte finally arrived at the gentleman's office and, quickly opening the door, greeted him, shrugged, and said good day. The man, who at that moment was sitting at his desk studying various papers on work, looked toward the exit in surprise. And when he saw Charlotte, he didn't understand what she was suddenly doing here. The girl in turn very quickly walked over to his desk and leaned closer, Dylan at this time just silently watching her. Well, when she was already right beside his chair, he looked at her and asked her why she had come so suddenly, for he was just enjoying his privacy, sorting out various papers. The girl suddenly hesitated. Afterwards, smiling, she asked, "Did he say she couldn't come in so suddenly?" In fact, Charlotte hoped it would annoy him, because coming without prior arrangement was definitely a sign of bad manners. But at that moment, the girl suddenly hummed in surprise and asked, "Or is he just hiding something, since she's not allowed to come to him like this?" The king was silent for a while and just looked at her sternly, trying to figure out what she even wanted. Charlotte at this moment was mentally doing a victory dance, for Mr. Dylan very much disliked being distracted from his work. In fact, everything was quite calm in the royal palace. Only the last few years before that, there had been an incredible bloody power struggle between the heirs. And in it only Mr. Dylan and his younger brother survived. They were certainly not first in the line of succession. And so suddenly Delana became that king after all. And after all the turmoil in the royal palace, the Lord worked tirelessly day and night to make this country a better place. For the sake of peace and tranquility in the kingdom, he was ready to give all his sleepless nights and worked just so for the peaceful life of people. It was therefore not difficult for Charlotte to guess that he would hardly be pleased at her suddenly bursting out to him. She had to do it, however, for otherwise they could not avoid a bad end. After a while of silence, the girl moved closer and closer to him, and smiled and said that he had that look on his face, and wondered why he didn't just tell him straight out what he was thinking right now. In fact, the girl thought he'd say she was really bothering him and order her to leave or something. But for a while they just looked at each other. After that, Dilla suddenly pulled her to him and kissed her on the top of her head. When Charlotte felt it, she was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand why he suddenly did it. He held her close to him for a while. After that, he leaned down to her ear and told her she had a really cute selfie. And he wouldn't even mind that kind of thing. He deposited her in his lap and said with a smile that there was really nothing else for him to do after such a thing, but to give in to such provocations. Charlotte was all red with embarrassment and not understanding what was going on. And Dylan also said that since she wanted him to rest so badly, he did it for her. The girl tried to get out, but she could not get out, for the king was holding her very tightly. Then he smiled and said that Leonardo was not a fool to have sent her to him. Charlotte, hearing this, was very much surprised. And then she stopped her attempts to get out and looked at him in surprise and asked him why it was suddenly about Mr. Leonardo. She did not understand it. She had noticed, of course, that he wasn't around the king at some points, but she still didn't understand how he felt about the situation. But at that moment, Dylan smiled and said that she was always pretending as if she didn't understand anything. He thought it was funny. Charlotte thought angrily at that moment that it was, in fact, he always mistakenly thought that she knew everything, when in fact, she didn't at all. But when Dylan realized that she really didn't understand, he explained, pointing to a stack of papers, that it had become quite busy lately, and he had absolutely no time to relax. However, his faithful assistant, Leonardo, is always trying to get him to take at least a little bit of a break, which of course the gentleman doesn't like. Charlotte, hearing all this, thought for a moment. Afterward, looking at the stack of papers, she said that he must be doing it because the man was overworked, and Leonardo must be taking care of him. Dylan pondered her words for a while, but afterward he said that, in fact, sometimes it was good to work too hard. Then he looked at the girl with a playful smile and said that he was the one who had fallen into Leonardo's trap, and now that Charlotte was with him, he and resting. At that moment the girl could not believe that the king really thought that Leonardo had asked her to come for the sake of helping her to rest his majesty. In that case, the girl decided that the best way would be to tell him that none of this was true. His judgment was wrong. So in a very rough voice, Charlotte turned to his majesty and said that no one had actually asked her to come to him. She didn't have time to finish her thought, seeing she was suddenly interrupted by Dylan's hand, which suddenly began stroking her head. He waved his head at her and said that of course she could think what she wanted. Then he also asked, did Leonardo ask her to deny everything on purpose, so that the king would not be angry with him? But Charlotte said at once that she had not, for she had really come of her own free will. Dylan didn't let her finish again. He put his hand on her cheek, and moving closer and closer to her, said that the girl was actually very kind and caring. Charlotte tried to deny it, but she realized that it would be useless, and that the master would insist on his own way, so it was easier for her to agree. Soon she was on her way back to her chambers, and as she walked down the corridors, she thought about the fact that all her schemes were having the opposite effect of what she wanted exactly, and that really annoyed Charlotte. Each time Dylan misunderstands their relationship, because of this only improves, they start to get closer, and the man gets used to her. Charlotte thought it was all just unbelievable, and thought about how some force seemed to be fixing everything she was trying to break, causing all her plans to fall apart. Because of this, the girl does not know if she will even be able to defeat her. However, she definitely needs to do something to avoid this terrible bad end, because she does not want to die herself, nor to endanger her favorite hero. Soon she was escorted to a special room where many women were gathered. They were discussing something and were eager to get close to His Majesty in order to become his wife. The women were going to make sure he remembered them and chose them. When Charlotte passed by, no one breathed out a sigh of relief, glad that the women's section of the palace was finally lively. As they passed all these ladies, Layla turned to her and said that at the moment, They were all excited in anticipation of the upcoming ball. When the girl heard this, she immediately remembered that there would be a ball very soon for His Majesty and his bride candidates. It would all be done only at the request of the aristocrats. However, Layla replied with a very cheerful voice that His Majesty would definitely invite her to dance. That was why she said that her family was right now preparing a dress for the girl that would be worthy of a duke's daughter. Charlotte, hearing this, immediately remembered that at the end of the novel, at the end of this love affair, the king invites the heroine to dance at the ball. And it's also just a very important moment in the story when they get even closer to each other. Many readers love this moment because it means that very soon they will be doing well, and the king will definitely choose Charlotte. However, now the girl was not excited, because if he invited her, it was a straight path to a bad end. But then suddenly she heard the voice of Layla, who, looking somewhere to the side, said that His Majesty had just arrived. Dylan talked to his assistant for a while. Afterward, glancing in her direction, he called Charlotte to him. The girl, of course, immediately went up to him and asked him in surprise what he was even doing in the women's section of the palace, for he had never been in the place. The man smiled and replied that he was currently in a meeting that concerned an upcoming ball. The girl was really panicked. She didn't understand why exactly everything was the way it was now, that she absolutely had to change this awful ball topic to something else. Charlotte turned around and said that since he had things to do, she would go. Dylan smiled slyly, however, and asked if she was getting ready for the ball at all. The girl was caught off guard by this question. However, she did not show it on her face, so she answered that she didn't. And smiling, she added that, apparently, he was very busy now, so she wouldn't bother him, so she would go. But Dylan still insisted on this conversation, and then said that she was something not very friendly, and after that he already wanted to give the reason why she didn't want to talk to him about this topic. Charlotte immediately became overwhelmed. She couldn't believe that he now realized what she was trying to do to make him hate her. But she was relieved when the man asked if she could dance at all. But it was actually the question that surprised her more. Dylan went on and said that was why she didn't want to talk about the ball. Now it was perfectly clear to him. Charlotte was not confused and immediately started shouting, saying that this is absolutely not true. She is the daughter of the Duke of Leicester, and she has been taught this since she was a little girl, so she's very good at dancing. But she immediately regretted those words, not realizing why she'd said it in the first place. Dylan held out his hand at that moment and said that, in that case, he wanted her to show what she could do. Charlotte didn't have time to do anything, but immediately found herself very close to the king, who held her by the waist. They stood in a special posture for dancing. Dylan suddenly started moving closer and closer to her face and asked if maybe she just wanted him to give her a dance lesson in order for the girl to remember the basics. Charlotte blushed when she heard that. She couldn't stand to be that close to him anymore, so she shoved him away, thanked him, but said she didn't need it. She, because she was very nervous, even started yelling and said that it was, on the contrary, he needed to learn proper manners when asking a girl to dance. Dylan was surprised when he heard it. He didn't understand why she was reacting so violently to everything, and Leonard, who was standing nearby, could barely contain his laughter. Charlotte, who was still incredibly angry, turned around and called Layla after her and started to leave. She said goodbye to the king and said nothing more to him. At this very time nearby, from around the corner, behind the whole scene, one of the ladies was watching them, but did nothing. Soon, when the girl had gotten far enough away that no one could catch up with her or hear her, she stopped and leaned against a column. She didn't understand what she had done again. But then her remorse was suddenly interrupted by a woman's voice. It was the one who had been watching them, and she asked if she remembered correctly that it was Mrs. Charlotte. The girl looked at the stranger and wondered who she even was. She realized that this girl was one of the candidates, but she did not remember her face. Then the stranger, proudly lifting her head upward, said that she was a candidate for the king's bride, namely Elizabeth, daughter of the Duke of Carteret. She suddenly looked at Charlotte carefully and said that she might be His Majesty's favorite, but girls shouldn't be so conceited. Elizabeth came very close to Charlotte and told her right to her face that it was she and no one else who would be queen. For a while they just stood there looking at each other. But after that, Charlotte lowered her gaze down and said nothing. Elizabeth did not understand why she was silent, and then asked indignantly, "Doesn't she even have anything to say?" Then Charlotte ceased to restrain her emotions, and coming very close to Elizabeth began to shout, saying that she had just a delightful enthusiasm. She also said that she will be straight up rooting for her and really hopes the girl does well.